All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Joanna Hossack, and I'm joined today by my wonderful colleagues, Dr. Amanda Reiman, Seth Avram LaRosa, and Dr. Margiana Petersen-Rockney, who'll be speaking in a moment. So we are very pleased to share our research on licensed and unlicensed cultivation across ban and permit counties in California. So our project goals, let's start with that. So the first objective is to estimate the total unlicensed cannabis cultivation amounts and their geography between 2018 and 2022. So the amount that's been cultivated in the state and also the specific locations of where that's occurring. The second objective is to identify local policies that are correlated with either the expansion or the contraction of the unlicensed market. And the third objective is to examine ultimately whether bans or permit ordinances are more effective at preventing unlicensed cultivation. So we have a mixed methods approach. We've got a lot of different special experts on this team. We're all bringing something different to the table. And we're looking at state water board data, looking at a first-in-kind mapping software called Cannabis. We have a legal research component, which is looking at local policy and implementation of that policy. We're looking at metric data, consumer surveys, and retail point of sale data. And finally, we have an ethnography component where we're going to have interviews, observations, and secondary material research. So one of the first steps in this project has been to analyze and catalog local policies. We're looking at ordinances in all 58 counties, so it is quite expansive. We're examining bans and permits. And then from that, we're going to create variables to inform the mapping component of the project, which will be discussed next. So you've seen this map already from the DCC's website showing that the most local jurisdictions ban cannabis activity and less regulate. And so in each of those frameworks, we're going to be looking at different aspects of the ordinance. So in ban counties, we're looking at investigation approaches, whether it's law enforcement or code enforcement, if it's using satellite imagery, enforcement practices, mainly, to what extent is law enforcement involved? Pretty much every county that bans use a public nuisance abatement process. And then they also implement some type of fine or penalty. And that's where things get really different, is that some counties, have a $500 fine, some it's like 30 grand. So that obviously has a pretty big impact in the penalties associated with unlicensed cultivation. We're looking at whether the enforcement is done by the sheriff or a special cannabis enforcement team, and then to what extent landlords or property owners are held responsible for unlicensed cultivation on their property. And then for permit counties, we're looking at all of those enforcement factors in addition to their structure for regulating. So what kind of permits do they have? Are they conditional use permits, ministerial business licenses? Are there permit or acreage caps? What is the local cannabis tax structure? What is the CEQA process? If there are any zoning or setbacks or other limitations on the location where cannabis can be cultivated legally, and then, comparing that ultimately with enforcement techniques against the unlicensed industry that is in a permit county. So the next kind of step in that process is to map unlicensed cultivation. So we're utilizing products from the California State Water Resources Control Board's machine learning platform called Cannabis. So what this does is it takes satellite imagery and it pairs that with a machine learning process to identify locations where outdoor cultivation and mixed light cultivation occur on a map. And with this, we hope to be able to estimate the unlicensed cultivation amounts in California and where those occur, which counties. And we're also going to be looking at terrain-based variables. So as you can see here, things like roads, streams, whether there's public land, forested land, slope, and then taking also all the work that we're doing, the planning code summaries, to create a list of variables that we can then put into this software, into this map, and see if there are any impacts from bans or from permitting ordinances that impact the expansion or contraction of cultivation in that county. So I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Amanda Reiman to talk about the next component of the project.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. So I'm going to talk about the triangulation of our estimates of unlicensed production and then how that follows through the supply chain to the consumer. So this is not dissimilar to how we measure alcohol, right? We look at how much alcohol is being produced, we look at how much alcohol is being bought, and then we look at how much people say they are consuming. Now, spoiler alert, these things usually don't match up. Especially when we talk about consumption, people are very bad at remembering how much they consume of something. But we're really trying to look at how these three measures match up. So on the one hand, we're looking at metric data to estimate the amount of cannabis produced in California in a given year. And this is in weight, right? Because we don't estimate the value of it at that point. It's really estimated in weight. And then we're looking at how much of that is going into a distributor's hands versus a manufacturer's hands, because we're really looking at flower here as the end product. It's very hard to estimate how much is going into an edible, how much is going into make distillate or isolate. So we're really looking at is whole flower that's either being sold in jars or uninfused pre-rolls. Then we're looking at utility company energy data to estimate indoor production, and Seth's going to be talking about that in a minute. But we had to figure out a way to look at not only licensed energy production, which we know where the licensed cultivators are, but how do we identify unlicensed indoor cultivators? And one of the ways you do that is by looking at their energy use patterns. I don't want to step on Seth's toes, but there's a very particular energy use pattern that comes with indoor cultivation. It's usually 24 hours of light on, followed by a 12-12 cycle. So identifying buildings that fit this and trying to understand if they're cannabis cultivation. And then finally, using point of sale and consumer data to estimate the amount consumed and purchased in California. So this is work that I'm doing in my role as New Frontier Data. So we're analyzing point of sale data for dispensaries in California to determine the weight of flower bought through licensed dispensaries in the state of California for a given year. New Frontier Data also conducts a consumer survey. It's a national survey of over 4,000 consumers. It covers all 50 states, and the sample is matched to each state's census in terms of age, ethnicity, and gender. So we're able to look at people's consumption habits. We ask them, how much flower do you consume in a given week? Again, take that number with a grain of salt. But we're able to take that data and then blow it out to the entire state of California to estimate how much people in California say they're consuming in a given week. And then from that, we can get annual data. Now, we're asking people that both use and don't use dispensaries. So we're able to look at both folks who say my primary source is licensed retail and people who say my primary source is a dealer or friends and family, and look at differences in consumption amounts in those two different groups. We're then going to combine that together and see how much cannabis can we account for. So many, many years ago, I did a postdoc at the Alcohol Research Group here on campus. And even with all of the nuances and how they asked people about their consumption, they were only ever really able to account for about 53% of the alcohol sold in the United States through what people say they actually consume. When we talk about beer, it's a bit easier because it's 12 ounces. But when you talk about wine and liquor, people don't know how much they're putting in their drink. They do not know how big their glass of wine is. So even though somebody might be buying an eighth of cannabis, it's very difficult for them to know how much they're consuming at a given time, because everybody's bowl is different. The size of joints that people roll are different. So we really go by how much they're purchasing. And that helps them understand, I go through an eighth a week, I go through an ounce a month, and that really helps us with those consumption totals. All right, Seth, you're up.
Hi, everyone. My name's Seth LaRosa. I'm a graduate student researcher with the Cannabis Research Center, and I'm in the Land Use Change Lab. This portion of the project came about in thinking about how to estimate illicit or unpermitted indoor production. This is a puzzle that people have been trying to solve for a long time in the state of California. The idea, and it hasn't borne out all the way yet, but we're in the process of requesting the data right now from PG&E, and we have a green light from them for this portion of the project. So the idea is to get some user data from PG&E for the permitted sites that we know are engaged in industrial scale cannabis production. And then using a machine learning model, try to determine the energy signature. As Amanda was pointing out, there's a very distinct signature from indoor production, just from, for agricultural necessity of growing anything basically under lights, right? You have a time period where you're going to have full 24-hour light, then there'll be a period of darkness, and in many instances, you'll see a distinct 12-12 signature for the flowering period. So the idea is if we can match this energy signature with machine learning to get a sense of what that signature looks like for licensed production, we could then go and run that model over a larger data set to try to establish unlicensed production in areas. This could be really interesting, not just for this project going back to 2018, but going all the way, for future projects or future ideas with this data or with this model. Looking at, for instance, like Measure Z in Oakland, which was, I think, 2004, where you saw like a lot of indoor production happening really quickly in Oakland when the city voted to make cannabis enforcement its lowest priority. So if we could get this model working, we could go back and look at areas spatially that we know there was an increase in production temporally in a certain time period, to sort of test the model to see how robust it is and to see what kind of changes have occurred, not just since 2018, but conceivably going as far back as the data would allow. Again, we're working with PG&E right now, and the idea is if we can get this model running, we'll petition SoCal Edison, that does most of the power and electrical use for the southern half of the state, as well as like smaller municipal providers like Ukiah and some small municipalities have their own energy production places. So that's the general idea. And yeah, I'm hoping it works. I'll let you know. Yeah. And I think next up, we're going to talk about interviews. I'd like to invite Dr. Rockney Petersen back up. Yeah, thank you.
So another step of this project is to sort of ground truth and understand what's actually happening in communities on the ground. So what we'll do is select a number of case studies of about 8 counties for permit, for ban, based on some of this quantitative and mapping data. And then we will conduct interviews with people on the ground, including cultivators and local policymakers. And then we'll code that data with a special eye towards the impact of sort of policy interventions. And then we'll be able to pair that qualitative data with the statistical modeling and the spatial data that we have to really try to understand in a very interdisciplinary and multi-methods way the effect of policy interventions and spatial variables on the patterns of both unlicensed and permit production. And then finally, some next steps. Right now, we're at the stage of getting ready to select those 8 counties, those 4 ban, 4 permit counties to do this ethnographic research, which we will do starting later this summer, which will also include some archival analysis, depending on what those counties are, looking at, policy documents, et cetera. And then we'll analyze factors that influence unpermitted cultivation, and then estimate the total unlicensed production, where cultivation occurs and the policies that influence unlicensed production.